My name is Brooklynn Flanigan, and I am a senior studying exercise and sports science with a concentration in health and wellness. I did my undergrad research on a comparison of the acute effects of aerobic and anaerobic exercise on executive functioning using the Stroop test. I hope you enjoy my presentation. A comparison of acute effects of aerobic and anaerobic exercise on executive functioning using the Stroop test. An overview of what this presentation is going to look like. I'm going to start with my introduction, then talk about my study parameters, the methods I used for my research, the results of my research, and then finish with a discussion and conclusion. Introduction. Executive functioning. Our brains carry out a diverse amount of functions, from memory to auditory processing, controlling our movements, and much more. One very important function of our brain is executive functioning. Executive functioning is used for planning, organizing, and controlling goal-directed behaviors. This process occurs in the prefrontal cortex of our brain, and it is responsible for our higher level thinking. The Stroop test. The Stroop test was designed in 1935 by psychologist John Ridley Stroop. Today, it is one of the most widely used neuropsychological assessments that is used to measure executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex. The Stroop test uses congruent and incongruent trials to test selective attention skills, processing speed, and overall executive functioning of the individual. In congruent trials, the ink matches the color words. For example, we see in this picture that blue is written in blue ink. Incongruent trials mix up the ink colors among different color words. For example, we see blue is written in yellow ink. For those of you who are not familiar with the Stroop test, I have provided an image to show what the questions might look like. Pictured on top is an example of what the congruent words would look like. Like I said, blue is written in blue ink. The bottom picture is an example of what an incongruent trial would look like. Blue written in yellow ink. The ink colors does not match. Aerobic and anaerobic exercise. In my study, my two independent variables were aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise is defined by the American College of Sports Medicine, or ACSM, as involving large muscle groups which enhance cardiorespiratory functioning. In lay terms, aerobic exercise is going to be any form of exercise where our bodies will be utilizing oxygen. ACSM defines anaerobic exercise as physical activity for a short duration where it or the body is fueled by energy sources independent of oxygen. Or in other terms, exercise where our bodies will not be using oxygen. This is often seen in the form of resistance exercise. Resistance exercise is an exercise aimed to improve muscle strength or endurance by working against a force, often accomplished by using some form of weight, either body weight or lifting weights. Two studies that I wanted to highlight right now are effects of 30-minute resistance and anaerobic exercise on cognition in high school sample, and the effects of acute aerobic exercise on cognitive performance, the role of cardiovascular fitness. Harverson's study used 30-minute bouts of exercise and was important because it signified focusing on only acute bouts of exercise. This article also tests the comparison of aerobic and anaerobic exercise modes on executive functioning. The next study, done by Chang and Etnier, looked at the effects of aerobic exercise on executive functioning and different aerobic fitness levels of their participants. So first, I'm going to talk about the Harverson study. Harverson and colleagues used a randomized crossover design that allowed for each participant to engage in the exercise protocol. For the anaerobic group, this study used 6 multi-joint exercises for 2 sets of 15 repetitions. The aerobic groups engaged in 30 minutes of walking or jogging around an indoor track at 50 to 60% of their maximum heart rate. Executive functioning was tested at the end of each 30-minute bout of exercise using the Stroop test and the trail making test. The study showed significant differences between both the exercise groups and the non-exercise group, but there was no significant difference between the aerobic group and the resistance group when running the Stroop data analysis. The anaerobic protocol that I used for my study was based off of this study. Next, I'm going to talk about the Chang and Etnier. Chang and colleagues examined how an aerobic exercise protocol would affect executive functioning in groups of low, moderate, and high aerobically trained individuals. Aerobic exercise was 30 minutes at 65% of their VO2 max on an exercise bike. Participants engaged in a 5-minute warm-up, a 20-minute exercise time, and then a 5-minute cooldown. Congruent and incongruent Stroop scores were reported for both pre and post tests of each of the three groups. Statistically significant shorter times from pre to post Stroop testing was shown by all three groups. It was also noted that the low and moderate aerobic groups showed faster incongruent times than the high aerobic group. My aerobic protocol, which will be discussed later, was inspired by this study. My study parameters. The purpose of my research is to compare acute bouts of aerobic and anaerobic exercise on executive functioning. I used an online Stroop test to test executive functioning. I also wanted to look at participants' GPAs and see if it were to have an effect on Stroop scoring, regardless of the exercise format that the participants engaged in. And this is going to be discussed later in my presentation with my descriptive statistics. My hypotheses. My hypothesis is that there will be a greater executive functioning after an acute bout of aerobic exercise compared to an acute bout of anaerobic exercise. I also expect the GPA to not influence either group's Stroop test scores. The methodology. I had a total of 27 participants in my study. 12 participants in my anaerobic group from the strength training PED course, and 15 participants in my aerobic group from the conditioning PED course. Each participant was a college-age female, age 18 to 22 years old, who were currently active in their respective PED courses. 6 participants were excluded from my study due to exceeding the age limit or technical difficulties with their Stroop data collection. Before exercise, the anaerobic group was familiarized with the resistance exercises that they would be conducting, and the aerobic group was familiarized with their 75% heart rate max. Each group conducted a 5-minute warm-up period before starting their exercise protocol, which will be discussed in the next 2 slides. The Stroop test was taken within 2 minutes of exercise stopping. My anaerobic exercise protocol. My anaerobic exercise protocol consisted of 5 multi-joint exercises. We had chest press, leg press, unilateral pull-downs, seated or bent over rows, and the shoulder press. Participants were familiar with these exercises as they have been doing them in their PED class already. A demonstration of each exercise was still given to make sure that the participants were performing them with correct form. Participants were also instructed that the weight they were using was appropriate if by the 12th repetition, the exercise was becoming difficult, but the rep was still able to be performed with correct form. Each exercise was done 10 to 12 reps for 3 sets. Exercise order was not uniform throughout with each participant due to social distancing and limited equipment. My aerobic protocol. Before exercising, each participant was given their calculated 75% heart rate max. This was calculated by taking 220 minus the age of the participant and multiplying it by 0.75. Participants were then instructed that they would begin a 5-minute warm-up period. They were able to choose exercise bikes, treadmills, or the elliptical. At the 10-minute mark, their heart rate was taken, and they were told that they should be hitting their 75% heart rate max that they were given at the beginning of the study. Participants were instructed on how to adjust their machine in response to if their heart rate was either too high or too low. Participants then stayed at this heart rate for a total of 25 minutes. Rate of perceived exertion was taken at the 10, 12, 16, and 20-minute marks. At the 22-minute mark, heart rate was recorded once more. When participants hit the 25-minute mark, they were instructed to begin a 5-minute cooldown period. Once that 5-minute cooldown period ended, participants were instructed to immediately go to their laptops and begin the Stroop test. A Mann-Whitney U test was conducted to compare Stroop results for each of my exercise groups. This was due to an unequal population size between the two groups. To control for potential influences of GPA on the Stroop test results, an INCAVA was also ran. The results of my study. This table shows some general descriptive statistics of my participant population. Some things that I wanted to highlight were both PED courses had 6 upperclassmen, but the aerobic group had a wider distribution of younger classmen in their total population. Therefore, the aerobic group had a slightly younger population than our overall age population. The anaerobic group had an average age that was closer to the average age of the total population. The average Stroop score in the anaerobic course was higher than the overall average Stroop score. The GPA from the anaerobic group was slightly higher than the overall GPA, and the GPA for the aerobic group was just below the overall GPA of the total population. This chart highlights my Stroop effect in milliseconds of the overall Stroop effect, and then the Stroop effects for the PED courses. The aerobic group had a lower Stroop average than the overall average Stroop score. The aerobic score was favoring the incongruent Stroop tasks, and the anaerobic score was favoring the congruent Stroop tasks. The anaerobic data had an average that was higher than the overall average, and the aerobic data had an average that was lower than the overall average. As noted just previously, the data from the aerobic group is favoring the incongruent tasks. Having a higher incongruent score on the Stroop test means that the individual's executive functioning is lower than someone with a low incongruent score. To calculate the Stroop effect, we took the incongruent minus the congruent scores. Therefore, having a higher Stroop effect means that the executive functioning of the individual or group was lower, and having a lower Stroop effect means that the executive functioning of the individual or group was higher. The Mann-Whitney U test showed no significant findings between aerobic and anaerobic exercise on Stroop effect. When controlling for GPA, there were also no significant findings between aerobic and anaerobic exercising on Stroop effect. When looking at just Stroop effect, my p-value was equal to 0.608, and when we controlled for GPA, my p-value was equal to 0.871. Here's the chart from the Mann-Whitney U test to summarize, showing that my p-value was equal to 0.608. This is the chart that GPA was controlled for. We see here that the chart shows that there is a 0.001 effect size from my research. This means that the effect size of my research is very strong when we controlled for GPA. Discussions and conclusions. As noted, my research had no significant findings between aerobic and anaerobic exercise on the participants' executive functioning using the Stroop test. My original hypothesis that a greater executive functioning would be seen post-exercise in the aerobic group compared to the anaerobic group is rejected. With a strong effect size when controlling for GPA, there is potential for finding statistical significance with a larger population when GPA is being controlled for. I would need a control group to really determine if the exercise has an effect on executive functioning, regardless of exercise mode. Literature is flooded with testing exercise and different forms of cognition. For example, executive functioning and memory in children and older populations. There is currently not much out there regarding the young population and even more specific to the female-aged college population. In a study done by OWLS, they found that both aerobic and anaerobic exercising improved performance on the Stroop test. More research is needed to be done in the area of aerobic versus anaerobic exercise on executive functioning. Research has been done with other functions of the brain, however. In a study done by Pontifax and Hamilton, they found that aerobic exercise helps improve working memory, but working memory was not seen to improve with anaerobic or no exercise control groups. Future research. If I were to do my study again, I would like to add some changes. I would have a control group to add another layer to my data to really see if it's the form of exercise that is affecting my dependent variable, the Stroop test. I would also want to obtain a larger population size. We saw from my effect size that with a larger population, there's a chance for statistically significant findings. I would also like to track RPE and heart rate of the anaerobic exercise group. Doing this could help me gauge if each group had similar difficulties in their exercise protocol or if one was easier or harder than the other. Branching off from my study, I would like to recruit male participants. This would add to the literature out there comparing which form of exercise can lead to a greater executive functioning and higher cognition, and would not be as restricted as having an all-female population. This could also compare if one sex's executive functioning responds better to one particular form of exercise. I would also like to do a study with pre and post testing where my participants have had no previous training. With my current study, the participants were a few weeks into their PED courses, and so they had recently had some previous training. That finishes up my presentation on my undergrad research project, a comparison of acute effects of aerobic and anaerobic exercise on executive functioning using the Stroop test. If you have any further questions, I have placed my email below. Thank you to everyone who has viewed my presentation and to all of my participants.